Welcome to So-and-So, brought to you by Bernina, made to create. I'm Meg Goodman, and you're about to enjoy a casual conversation with a special member of the sewist and quilting community. A conversation about how they got started, what inspires them, what excites them, and their connection to this community. Our guest today is Sarah Veblen, who owns and runs Sarah Veblen Clothing Originals just outside Baltimore, Maryland. Born in Virginia and living in her youth in Texas and eventually California, Sarah began sewing as a teenager with the dream of having a sewing business. Well, that dream came true when she started her business in 1985. Sarah has a certificate in fashion design from Baltimore City Community College and a bachelor's degree from Stanford University. She's an active member of the Association of Sewing and Design Professionals, the American Sewing Guild, and the Haute Couture Club of Chicago. She's a sewist, teacher, and author, having written dozens of articles for Threads magazine, as well as other publications. She wrote the book, The Complete Photo Guide to Perfect Fitting, has created patterns for several small label women's clothing companies, and teaches through patternreview.com and her own website, sarahveblen.com. When not sewing, writing, or teaching, Sarah enjoys gardening. She grows both flowers and vegetables, and she loves to walk. She just loves to be out in nature. She currently lives in Phoenix, Maryland, which is just outside Baltimore, with her daughter, her daughter's husband, and 2 children, and she has all of her daughters in very close proximity. So that itself is something that she enjoys to do, spending time with her family as well. Sarah, hello and welcome to So-and-So.
Thank you. It's nice to be here, Meg.
You do a lot, especially with, I'm thinking of all those kids running around, and it keeps you busy, and, and then walking and enjoying things. And then you sew and you teach and you write, and there's so much that we're going to cover today. I want to go back to the beginning, and I love this story. Your mother sewed. And when you were in elementary school, you played with the scraps that she had and made doll clothes. Then in 9th grade, you started sewing some clothes for yourself, and you experimented, which kind of found its way as a thread, if it were, through your whole sewing career. But in high school, then you started to sew using patterns. So you asked your mom to teach you to sew, and she said you were already sewing circles around her. How did you teach yourself to sew?
Well, my mom showed me how to use the machine, and that was about the extent of it. And I would sew simple seams. And then a lot of how I learned to sew was through patterns in the late 1960s, well, actually mid-1960s. A lot of the patterns, especially Vogue patterns, had really excellent directions.
Mm-hmm.
And I learned to sew from that. I bought a couple of sewing books as well. And I really just thought about things a lot. I thought, well, they're telling me to do this, and how do I do it? What makes sense? And I think from a very early time in my sewing journey that I was what I encourage all my students to be, which is a thinking sewer. Don't just blindly follow those directions, but think about what it is that you're doing. And it wasn't too long before I thought, well, the instructions are telling me to do it this way, but I think it'd be better to do it this way. And I would try it. Sometimes it worked and sometimes it didn't. But that's a really good way to learn.
So hence that experimentation that you started out when you were sewing. And you said something I want to just go back to for a minute. You said sewists should not blindly follow instructions, but to see if it makes sense, and then maybe try something else that might make more sense. Is that a difficult thing for sewists to learn to do?
I think for some it is, and for others it's not. I know in the beginning of my sewing, I felt like, even though I experimented with directions, I felt like there was something that the pattern, well, how can I say this? I felt like the pattern ruled. I wasn't allowed to vary from the pattern itself. But
Mm-hmm.
interestingly, I did allow myself to experiment with how I was doing the construction. But that paper pattern, I felt like, well, I have to cut it out exactly the way it is. Now, of course, my viewpoint of patterns is that they're a wonderful starting place, but that's it. They are just the starting place.
Mm-hmm.
But I think a lot of sewists regard not just the pattern as the thing that has to be honored no matter what, but they think that instructions do as well.
Mm-hmm.
And one thing that I often tell people when I'm posing this concept of mine, that a pattern's a starting place, the instructions are one way to maybe go about doing putting the garment together, is that the person who drafted the pattern and then the person who wrote the instructions, and very often that's a different person in the fashion industry,
Mm-hmm.
and they don't know anything about you, what your lifestyle is like, what your clothing preferences are like. They don't know what fabric you have chosen. They don't know what kind of machine you have. They don't know anything about your sewing skills. They have just written a set of directions that will work, at least most of the time. I have found
Mm-hmm.
mistakes in instructions. And so what I try to get my students to think about is that we're always trying to individualize that pattern and the way we go about putting it together. If I make a silk blouse, I might use a slightly different construction techniques than if I make a cotton blouse or if I make
Mm-hmm.
a knit blouse.
There were a couple of events in your life that really helped shape your sewing. The first I want to talk about is your time in Boston when you were an executive secretary. And tell us how that line of work enriched your sewing abilities.
Well, it afforded me a good living. I was just out of college and I was able to support myself quite nicely on my on what I was making. Partly that goes back to having a good Stanford education and being able to write and think things through.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but in my spare time, everything that I wanted to do was to sew. I just lived in an apartment, so I didn't yet have a garden, and my focus was sewing. I sewed just about every single day. I loved the process of making garments. I loved fabric. I loved being able to walk into work the next day and have something brand new that nobody had ever seen before. But it is that being able to take a two-dimensional piece of fabric and end up with a garment, it fascinated me. And sewing was really my passion. As I said, I sewed almost every single day.
And then you started sewing your daughter's clothing. And that had a profound effect on your career trajectory. Tell us about that.
Yeah, so jump forward a number of years and I got married and had children. And a number of my friends, who many of them also had children, would look at what I had my first daughter dressed in. They go, "Oh my gosh, you can't find stuff like this. What you're doing, what you're making for her is really quite nice or interesting or fun or whatever." And a number of my friends and acquaintances said, "You should try to sell children's clothes." And so my first venture into using my sewing as a business was to make children's clothing and sell them through several different small handcraft galleries. There were two here in the Baltimore area, and then eventually there was a boutique in New York City that
Mm-hmm.
took my things. Um, and I had a lot of fun with that, and it was fun to come up with new ideas. I was doing all my own construction. And then at some point I thought, oh, if I have to make one more of those dresses or one more of those jackets, I'm going to pull my hair out.
Time to rethink.
Yep. Time for a diversion or another invention of my. I feel like I've reinvented myself a few different times.
What inspires you today?
In my sewing, fabric is probably one of the biggest parts of inspiration for me. I see a really interesting fabric to my eye, and I start dreaming about all the different things I can make.
Mm-hmm.
I work that way most of the time. Occasionally, I'll think I want to make this garment, and then I will set out to look in my own collection of fabrics or go to a store and buy a fabric for that. But most of the time, fabric is my inspiration, as well as in combination with that, um, I love Pinterest. I laugh to myself when I say that because when my kids first introduced me to Pinterest, we're like, why would anybody use this?
Yes.
And then I realized what a wonderful resource it is. And many of my Pinterest boards are public. So you can find me. It's just my name, Sarah Veblen, if you're wondering what interests me, what appeals to my eye. But it's interesting because there's not always a direct correlation between what's on my Pinterest boards and what it is I'm sewing,
Mm-hmm.
in terms of, okay, here is a project I'm working on right now, and this was the inspiration picture. But a lot of times it's an amalgamation of things that I've seen on Pinterest or seen in museums, and especially going to fashion exhibits. Sometimes it's going to clothing stores and looking at clothes. So it's a grouping of ideas that have come together for me,
Mm-hmm.
that then I'll decide what to make a certain fabric into.
Since fabric's so inspiring for you, have you ever thought of designing your own fabric?
No.
No. So there is no question about your answer.
That's an entirely different specialty.
Sure.
And I will say, when I very first started to, actually when I had started doing selling a few children's clothing, I was still doing some weaving, and I was weaving and I was spinning and I was doing some natural dyeing, and I was really interested in it. But I finally said to myself, if you want to become really good at something, then I think you're going to have to choose. And it wasn't that I had to, because I could have remained a dabbler and had my hands in a lot of different pies. I knitted, I crocheted, I cross stitch, any kind of handwork I loved. But I decided that I needed to get rid of my loom and just focus on sewing.
Mm-hmm.
I feel the same, very similarly, about designing fabric. That's its own specialty. I could learn it. I'm sure it would be fascinating. But given how short our lives are, when you look back at it all together, sewing was what I really wanted to do. I could concentrate on and focus on, and I've never regretted that decision.
Never look back.
No.
Sarah, you have a degree from Stanford, which is definitely a notable institution. What did you learn during that time at Stanford that you're able to apply to your career today?
As a freshman at Stanford, when I went to school in the late 60s and early 70s, freshman English was extremely rigorous. And you wrote and you wrote and you wrote and you wrote. You wrote all of the time.
Mm-hmm.
And anything you wrote got critiqued by a TA or the professor or your peers. And it was very rigorous. As a freshman, I really didn't like it so much.
Oh, sure.
But it made me comfortable with language. And when I later was in the Boston area and working as a executive secretary, I realized how valuable that was, all of the training, because I could write and I could edit. pretty decently.
Mm-hmm.
And so through my later, as I got my sewing business off the ground doing custom clothing, and then I remember David Coffin from Threads magazine calling me saying, I'm in the area and somebody else who writes for us has recommended I come by your shop and see what you're doing. And he looked at what I did and he said, we'd like you to write some Threads articles. And he had a number of ideas for me. And I was astounded. I had never submitted a proposal to Threads. And he assured me that the Threads would put it into what I refer to as Thread speak. They would put it into their formatting. But as I continued to write for Threads, I think I was an author that many of the Threads editors enjoyed working with, at least from what David Coffin said to me, because I knew how to write. And I tended to write more than they needed, but that made their job easy to condense it and put it into their formatting. And that writing has stood by me in, probably a dozen different ways in addition to Threads magazine.
You were sewing, you were writing, and you decided to become a teacher. So share this journey with us. As if you didn't have anything else to do.
Well, I laugh only because it wasn't that one day I woke up and thought, oh, I want to teach sewing too. What happened was I had built, after I went to fashion school here at a community college in Baltimore, I was doing custom clothing. That's really what I wanted to do. And I did not have a line of clothing. It was all custom work. I was developing, fitting people and developing patterns for them and sewing individual garments for individual people. And I really loved the fitting part of it. And I loved helping that person figure out how to express themselves with their clothing. And I had a lively business. I worked full time, probably twice full time. And at one point, I almost always had a stitcher who did basic construction for me. I did all of the fitting and pattern work and interface with the clients. And at one point, I had, I think, 3 different stitchers. I was just churning custom clothing out. And custom clothing is very stressful because basically you're selling something that doesn't exist, and then you have to live up to that. So you're selling a concept, and then you have to make it happen. And I was lucky that my communication skills with my clients and my fitting and sewing skills, and I often would help them pick out fabric and make wardrobes. All of that worked, but it was very stressful and it was hard to make a full-time living off of it, although I was supporting myself and my girls at that point. And a few people who had heard of me through some local sewing stores called me and said, we love to sew, but we're having trouble getting our garments to fit the way we want. Could we come and work with you and learn? Could you help us get a better fit? And so my head was totally into custom clothing. And I thought, okay, yeah, I might as well help somebody. I don't then have to make the garment at least, I just have to do the fitting and help them with their pattern work, which seemed to be like a fun thing. And I found that I really enjoyed it. And so I let my local fabric store, which is called A Fabric Place, it's a fabulous independent fabric store. I let them know that I was happy to help people interested in garment sewing to teach them whether it was machine skills or fitting or pattern work or whatever. And I had a lot of experience doing that whole gamut of things because of creating custom clothing for so long. And I found out just doing it that I really love teaching. I love being able to help the people who were interested in sewing their garments for themselves to have more success with their garments, to be happier with their garments. A lot of it came down to fit, and that it was the expertise I developed and really worked at in my custom clothing business. And I was really happy to pass that along and help other sewists who were interested in making garments for themselves get a lot more pleasure from their sewing experience.
Do you have a story that you can share with us of somebody that you worked with and how your guidance helped them to create something special?
Well, I think, yes, there is certainly something special. And do you mean in terms of my custom clothing and alteration business, or in terms of teaching sewists to help them with their garments? Because I have stories on both ends of that.
Pick your favorite one and choose your favorite.
Okay, I'll choose an alteration. And this can, if you extrapolate it, goes into being people who sew. They may have experienced these types of things. I had a gal come to me with a wedding dress that needed to be fit and altered for her. It was a ready-to-wear dress, and I did a lot of alteration and bridal alteration at the time. And brides are interesting to work with. There is sort of a whole thing that comes along with it, because a lot of brides are consumed with everything that they have to do in front of them. And this bride was, I was going to say laid back, but she was almost unenthusiastic. And I found that really odd. And so as I was looking at the dress on her, one of the things that I had learned to always ask my clients, whether it was a custom client or an alteration job, was, how do you feel in this garment? And this one particular gal said, I don't feel like myself. I feel like I'm somebody else. I feel like I'm an imposter. And I said, well, talk to me. How do you want to feel on your wedding day? I said, I'm not asking you what you want to look like. I'm asking you, if you close your eyes and think about when you are walking into that ceremony and then for your reception afterwards, how do you want to feel? And she started to describe that she wanted to feel elegant, but relaxed, not too formal. And as we talked for about 5 minutes about this, it gave me so many clues as to what I could do with her dress to make her feel that way. So it pulled it away from what do you want to look like, but your clothes can make you feel better and more relaxed. And that's a big care, having had that experience and many times over in my custom work and alteration work. It's something I brought into all of my teaching, or a great deal of my teaching with my students now, which is you want your clothes to express something about yourself. And so I always talk with them, my students, about you're designing from the inside out. You aren't taking an image of a garment and putting it on top of yourself. You might do a little bit of that, but really what I want to get at is to be designing from the inside out.
You mentioned earlier that you love the complexity of garment making. So would you walk us through this complexity and share why it resonates with you?
I think I like a challenge, for one thing.
Sure.
And as we've talked about already, I'm an experimenter. I'm happy to make samples and figure things out about what technique is going to work the best. For instance, there are probably about 5 or 6 different ways to do a welt pocket. So in a particular fabric, what's going to work the best? So experimentation, I think, is important. But the complexity that I am intrigued with is that for us garment sewers, we have to know how to read a pattern or develop a pattern, draft a pattern, drape a pattern. So we have to understand pattern making to some greater or lesser degree. We have to understand fit to some greater or lesser degree. I think a lot of serious garment sewers get very into fit. That's a real crux of what makes a garment work or not. We have to understand fabrics. It's a huge area. There are so many fabrics available to us. We have to understand drape and fiber content, dozens of things about fabric. And we have to understand to some greater or lesser degree something about design, i.e. what do we want our garments to look like? What are we evoking with them? What kind of buttons are we using? So from, small things like button choice to larger things like seaming and the overall design. And then we have sewing machine skills, but that's almost the least amount, the least important. I mean, it's the crux of everything, but all of these other aspects of garment making are super important. So we're not just somebody who can crack an egg and fry an egg. We're somebody who can do a huge number, garment sewers do a huge number of things in their making of any single garment.
You mentioned fitting, and this may just be an obvious question, but why is fitting so important, and how does it correctly change the final product?
In several different ways, I think. When I was doing custom work, one thing that I found happened, and this was prior to my teaching, and I carry it over into my teaching, is that a number of people would say to me as I fit them and went through however many muslins it took, it helped them start to see the garment come to life. But very often they would say, "Oh my gosh, I look so much better now in the process of my getting the garment to fit."
Mm-hmm.
I often would get feedback from people saying, they let me know that they had worn the garment that I had made for them, and that their friends or family members or whoever said, "Oh my gosh, you look like you've lost some weight." And they wouldn't have, but it's just that their garment fit them more appropriately. And I think also having a good fit makes us more comfortable in our garments.
Mm-hmm.
An example that I use a lot is we have all had a day, and I've had lots of them, where I put something on, and for whatever reason that day, I don't feel good in it, and it doesn't feel right. And sometimes it's a store-bought garment and it doesn't fit me, but sometimes it's even a garment that I've made, and for that day, it just isn't the right thing. But we've all had these days where we think we've worn something, we've gone out to, a meeting or whatever it is, and we think, "Oh, I cannot wait to get home and take that garment off."
Mm-hmm.
It's happened to you, right?
Oh yes, I'm smiling because I have been there.
And what I found is you obtain a better and better fit, taking into account comfort and your lifestyle and different elements that I think are important to consider, is that we have fewer and fewer of those days because our garments fit us. And I have a very strong belief that when we feel good in our clothes, when the fit is right, the fabric is right, the garment really works for us, I feel like we are more relaxed in ourselves, in who and what we are. And that in turn allows us to be, for one thing, more creative, but we can think better, we can interact better with those around us. Everything just seems to be in better sync at that point and not so jumpy.
That makes sense. Sarah, you believe very deeply that pursuing a creative endeavor enriches people's lives in many ways. How so?
Well, part of it is what I was just referring to. And an extension of what I was just talking about is I believe everybody has creativity in them. I think that very often it gets subdued or perhaps even beaten out of us at some stage in our lives. But I think being creative is something that comes from the inside of us, from our emotions as well as our intellect. And I think it makes us a fuller, rounder person. I think it enriches our lives in countless ways. I think creativity for many of us, if not all of us, is a very calming aspect to our lives that we can um, uh, find solace in being creative. And for most creative people, at some point or another, we have reached flow or we're in the zone, and you look up and you go, oh my gosh, an hour just passed. I was completely immersed in that.
Mm-hmm.
And and that is what flow or being in the zone is all about. And that your mind is just totally into it, and you are kind of in a altered place, space in your head. And it is, to me, finding that, being able to access that, is a wonderful way to enrich ourselves, but also to reset ourselves. If I'm having a jumpy day and I think, okay, if I can just go sew for a little bit, I can calm myself, and then I can get going again in a positive manner
Mm-hmm.
and leave the jumpiness aside.
It's calming just to hear you talk about that. So there is no doubt that you feel this when you sew. So for sewists throughout their sewing journey, what's important for them to keep in mind?
To have fun with it, to enjoy it, and that if they are not enjoying it, to stop and think about why that's happening,
Mm-hmm.
and to take some steps to change it around so that they will enjoy it. And that could be that they need to be stricter with themselves to make sure that they have the time to sew. I'm the pot calling the kettle black here. It's like,
Mm-hmm.
I certainly could do a good deal of that. But also it's that sometimes we hit a spell where we think, I want to make this, or I've been trying to make this and I can't do it. I don't know how. So maybe we need to reach out to a sewing professional or do some research online and see what we can find that helps us.
Mm-hmm.
And I think sewists can, over a long period of time or over a short period of time, they can rejuvenate themselves. They can keep themselves fresh by then finding new things to challenge themselves as well. But sometimes too many new things is just overwhelming.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's super important to really enjoy the process. So some people sew to get the end result, that they want a garment that they can wear. And I'm not really familiar with quilting. I certainly appreciate what quilters can do. It's not my thing. So
Mm-hmm.
anytime I'm talking about sewing now, it has to do with garment sewing. And there are some garment sewers who are very product oriented. And I think if you can turn that so that you are more process focused, your enjoyment very often will go up. Now, don't get me wrong. I love having a finished product. So I'm not saying that that's unimportant, but I think immersing into the process and letting yourself understand that there is a process and that you have some control over developing your process so it's more satisfying is a really important key to being a happy sewer.
Mm-hmm. Sarah, tell us about your grandchildren.
oh, the joy of my life. Of so many people, when I would meet grandparents before I was lucky enough to have grandchildren, they would say, grandchildren are just the best. Well, they
Mm-hmm.
are. They're wonderful.
Mm-hmm.
So I have 5 grandchildren. from two of my daughters who have children. The third daughter does not have children, but is a happy aunt. And I have a 11-year-old girl, a 8-year-old girl, a 6-year-old boy, a 4-year-old boy, and a 2-year-old girl. And those youngest two are the two that I live with. And we laugh a lot.
I think it's their job to make grandparents laugh.
I think so. And these little ones, all of them do a good job at it.
Any of them shown any interest in sewing?
Yeah. My oldest granddaughter a few years ago made her and her sister a dress. They are all those older grandchildren are deep into sports right now, and I don't know if I can rekindle that. My grandson, who I live with, who is 4, loves being in my sewing area, and he loves picking the pins up and putting from a magnetic cushion into a wrist pin cushion. But I recently was making some pants for my elderly mother, and he wanted to help me, help in quotes, and he wanted to sit on my lap. And I thought, okay, what can I do here? And I handed him a pair of little thread snips and did a little seam on a scrap of fabric and said, okay, cut these thread tails. And I showed him how to cut right down against the fabric without getting the fabric and without leaving a tail. And we sewed 2 pairs of pants that afternoon, and he cut every single thread for me. And he loved it when I went to the serger and he could cut those serger threads off. And it was slower. It slowed me down a little bit, but it was so much fun. And fast forward about 3 or 4 weeks, and on one weekend day, he looked at me. All my grandchildren call me Sassy. And he said, Sassy, can we make more pants today? Which, of course, just thrilled me. We weren't able to that day, but he's very interested in the machinery and in the scissors. And I hope in another year or so I can get him set up at a small table and get him working with the machine.
You know, I can hear you smiling when you talk about them. It's pretty special.
It is. They are something else.
Sarah, what's next for you, and what's your dream?
Well, I am in my early 70s now, and I keep making noises about retiring. But I've finally decided I don't really want to retire. I love what I do. I love working with my students and being in the sewing world too much. But I am slowly cutting back. And part of what I have been starting to focus on in cutting back so I have more time to do what I want to do is to develop sort of a legacy, a lot of information that is going to be available so that when I do finally retire, the methodologies that I have developed in fitting and approaching design and everything that I teach is that information is available in one way or another. I have been making free YouTube videos, so people can find me on my Sarah Veblen Clothing Originals channel. And I try to get a new one out one or two a month now. And then I also am developing some courses of study that will be available in probably about 9 months or so on my website, through my website. So I feel like I have a good contribution to make to the sewing world, especially the fitting world and the design world. And I don't want to just close up shop and poof, have that gone. I want to share whatever it is that I have figured out and have been able to teach so far. I want to make that available on a continuing basis. that's a strong dream of mine.
It is. You will be busy for a while.
Yeah.
In our conversation today, was there any question that I didn't ask you that you wish I had?
Ooh, what an interesting question. No, I could talk about sewing for hours and hours and hours. I think it's a fascinating pursuit. As you and I did touch on, I think the complexity is really interesting, and I think that I would encourage any and all people who sew to at least try out garment sewing, and if they find it at all rewarding to pursue it, that it's something that has enriched my life immeasurably, and that goes back to the importance of creativity in my life. Those are the biggest messages that I have. I feel like I always feel like I would like to thank the students who have followed me for so many years or have recently found me, because it's them who have made all of this possible for me.
Sarah, I have thoroughly enjoyed talking to you today, and I know we all have. And I want to thank you for sharing your story with us.
Oh, it's been an absolute pleasure, Meg. You're wonderful to talk with.
Well, thank you. Now, the people who have heard this conversation today, I'm sure would love to reach out to you. What's the best way for them to do that?
They can get me through my email is the best way to get me, sarah@sarahveblen.com. You can go to my website, which is www.sarahveblen.com. And I try to answer all emails. Sometimes I'm a little slow doing it, but occasionally I have somebody email me a question, and then when I answer, they go, "Oh, I didn't know that you would actually respond." And I do try to respond to my emails. And if people are interested in ways to study with me, there is information on my website. I have several different levels of ways to study with me. I offer live video classes a couple of times a month usually, but also it's working with people individually that I really have found to be exceptionally rewarding. And one thing that came out of the COVID pandemic was many of us learned to work on Zoom, and that lets me work with people across the country. And a lot can be accomplished with sewing, even though it's a hands-on hobby or creative pursuit. A lot can be discussed and accomplished through Zoom calls.
Thank you again, Sarah, for joining us. It's been a pleasure.
It's been wonderful. Thank you for giving me the opportunity. And I hope that some people listening to this have enjoyed it as much as I think you and I have enjoyed recording it.
I have no doubt. Well, there you have it, another story about someone just like you, someone for whom sewing or quilting is so much more than a hobby. It's a way of life and a connection to something bigger. If you know someone you think has an outstanding story, a story that should be shared on this podcast, please drop me a note to meg@soandsopodcast.com or complete the form on our website. Be sure to subscribe to, review, and rate this podcast on your favorite platform, and visit our website, sewandsopodcast.com, for more information about today's and all of our guests. That's sewandsopodcast.com. And finally, I want to thank Bernina for making this program possible. I'm Meg Goodman, and I look forward to you joining us next time on So and So.